Cool. Well, I'm going to get us warmed up with some very small scale lore. So recently, right, we hopped on the alpha and we saw a whole bunch of people mention the first one. So the question is, it seems the first ones might have made the Shadowlands, or at least a very big bunch of dudes. So where do you think they might fit into that cosmology chart that you guys have been teasing us with for so very long?
That's a very good question. I mean, who made the Titans? The Titans there to begin with? Who created all of what we're seeing? What is the hierarchy of power in the Warcraft universe? I think what we are seeing, the Titans that we've dealt with in past Warcraft expansions up to now, as we saw face to face at the end of Legion, that was, a pantheon of order that we've seen placed on the cosmology. As we go to the Shadowlands, what we'll be learning is that there is a pantheon of death. And if you think of people like, or beings like the Archon in Bastion, Denathrius in Revendreth, the Winter Queen, these are effectively analogous to the Titans that we know in our world that we have interacted with, but they are the pantheon of death. And the question is, how does the Jailer fit into this? How does the Arbiter fit into this? Those are things we're going to learn. And
okay, that is... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I know. That's just a little nugget.
Yeah.
And then, is there some higher structure above and beyond that? Those are good questions. I think that's something we want to begin to delve into. Because one of the natural questions that many people asked, really 3 years ago now, hey, we just dealt with Titans. We just faced off against a manifestation of Sargeras. Where do we go from here? Well, that's something we need to start exploring.
Nice. Yeah, I've got the feeling Steve's been running around the office with that cosmology chart, really trying to go big. I suppose I've got a similar one. So we've got this pantheon of order that we know about, and one of them just so happens to have the title of Life Binder. Now, if Azeroth is a prison, as Sylvanas claims that it is, could a Life Binder have had anything to do with that?
I mean, anything is possible, though that feels like, sometimes they're just artful terms that sound cool that are chosen long ago before we dreamed up any of these stories, so I wouldn't necessarily read too much into all of that. Though, one interesting facet of Bolvar, who's going to play a prominent role as sort of a bridge between two worlds, is that he's in the unique position of being someone who was seared by the flames of the Lifebinder, but has also worn the Helm of Domination and has an anchor into one realm while also having vision and insight into the other. So that kind of puts him in a unique situation.
Yeah. Okay. So I suppose on that, it's getting us close to souls and Anima, and we've all been talking about Anima for quite a bit. So we know that Anima is like this accrued power within a soul, right? So your Anima grows, you die, you go to the Shadowlands, it's slurped up into some sort of realm where it's used. So we know almost all of this process. But there's one question that's been teasing us for a long time in the office, and that is, where does the Anima come from? Does it pop into the material realm like the Titans seemingly did, or is it perhaps from some sort of lifelands?
I mean, that's the rules of existence, really. I mean, where does gravity come from? How do magnets work? These are the questions that puzzle us. This is just how life energy, this is just how a soul is formed, and the energy that accrues over the course of that life's experience and deeds. Now, who put all these rules in motion? Who is the clockmaker behind it all? Again, there are bigger questions that we will continue to delve into over many years to come as we unravel the way the Warcraft universe is assembled. But I don't know that we're going to be specifically trying to answer that question within the Shadowlands.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting seeing the lore grow, like with the first Night Warrior. We just heard Steve talk about there being Night Warriors from other worlds, kind of suggesting that Elune is like more than just this Azeroth moon god, right? It's like has been called a true deity before. And I guess that did get us feeling, well, number one, this really seems to be a part of the broader plan that's going on with maybe the first ones and making that lore bigger, maybe zooming us out on that cosmology chart. But we did notice as well, ANR was hiding out on Elunaria. And that planet, that seems like a decently targeted name for it.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps.
Okay. That's
yeah,
one to
I
pay
mean, and I
attention
think when it comes to the Night Warrior and the nature of, I think there'll be some light shed on these interactions and relationships in the story of Ardenweald, and particularly in the max level Covenant campaign of the Night Fae for those who choose that Covenant. Tyrande is certainly going into the Shadowlands. She is definitely consumed with a desire for vengeance. She has a score to settle with Sylvanas, and that hasn't gone away just because some treaty got signed at the end of Battle for Azeroth. And in the course of that, we'll be learning a bit about the nature of what the Night Warrior is, what that means. But I don't want to get ahead of the story that is yet to be told.
Yeah. Cool. So I think there's one I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this, because your answer a while ago certainly sent us off in a loop of videos. Time in the Shadowlands. So we've heard it goes a little bit funky, and we kind of noticed the Heart of Oribos looks a little bit like the Nightwell. So we've been kind of wondering, could we be gone for longer than we thought when we actually emerge from the Shadowlands? And the part two of that is, when we go to Shadowlands, canonically, are we cut off like we were in Warlords of Draenor?
Okay, so I'd like to take this opportunity to clarify a bit of what I said about time and the perception of time. So I think this is not a time dilation relativity kind of space where time moves differently. And I probably didn't phrase that as well as I could have or should have. I think the question that was originally asked was, some characters that we may meet in the Shadowlands, to them it feels like they have undergone a ton of experience since we last saw them in Azeroth. How does that work? And the analogy I was giving was that time is maybe perceived differently. Think of a dream. You might go to sleep for 6 hours, but in your mind, within that dream, you can experience time and many events that may span a much wider, range of time. But when you wake up at the end of the day, it's just been 6 hours. So that's more about how the Shadowlands are perceived by souls that go there, and the personal journeys of self-discovery that they may undergo. Someone who is brought to Bastion and becomes an aspirant within the Kyrian Order and rises in stature within that order. To them, that process may have felt like it took longer, but in reality, they only died 2 or 3 years ago canonically. That's the explanation there. It's not that once we're in the Shadowlands, it's like being inside the event horizon of a black hole, and every day in the Shadowlands is actually 5 days on Azeroth, or vice versa. So I wouldn't read too much into the timey-wiminess of it, but as we go into the Shadowlands and encounter souls who are souls of the dead that had stories that we knew back in Azeroth, they may have experienced to them more than would seem possible within the months or years since they were last alive.
Cool. Yes, I guess that's an exciting storytelling opportunity for giving the characters who come with us and some of the older faces a lot of character development, and then kind of clashing that against the old world that we ended up coming from.
Yes.
To sort of finish us off on a little bit of lore, then a few questions. So Uther's tomb, that was updated in Battle for Azeroth, and not a great deal has happened since. So is that something we could maybe expect to see perhaps in a pre-patch event?
I don't recall off the top of my head if it's featured in the pre-patch event. My recollection is, the tomb and updating it was, we were already looking at the area around Lordaeron in the run-up to BFA, and there are a range of just side projects, little hackathon passion projects, where we'll have interns come in who are trying their hand at doing work in the Warcraft style. And I believe it was just something that was done because it seemed cool. Genuinely, there was no deeper purpose to it beyond that. Though Uther certainly is a character that will feature prominently in Shadowlands storytelling, and particularly in Bastion. And for those who join the Kyrian, they'll learn more about his arc and what has come of him since he passed over into the Shadowlands. But I'm not sure if there's any direct connection with the tomb.
Cool. Well, that'll be a fun little project to have worked on. So, moving us away from lore and over to gameplay stuff. So, for the pre-patch, we've not heard that much about it yet, but what I'd maybe ask is, in style, are we going maybe closer to BFA, closer to Legion, or maybe Wrath in the direction the team wants to go with that?
I think for the pre-patch, Wrath is probably the closest inspiration. It's definitely, kind of being built internally as like Scourge Invasion 2.0. We've been told that there must always be a Lich King, because if there isn't, then the Scourge, the Undead, will rampage across Azeroth. Well, we've seen the Helm Shattered. What does that mean? It means bad times for sleepy villages across Kalimdor and Eastern Kingdoms and elsewhere. And so it's a bit of dealing with that, while narratively, the forces and champions of Azeroth are mustering in Northrend and Icecrown to prepare for an assault on the nexus of all of this at the top of Icecrown Citadel, which is what's going to kick off our trip into the Maw and the expansion proper. It's also some loose threads to track down, like, where's Nathanos up? And what's he up to? That we want to deal with during that pre-patch period.
Okay, nice. I think a lot of people, me included, are very, very excited for the idea of Scourge Invasion 2. I think for a more general one, before we dive into the sort of depth of Endgame, content cadence. So, slightly different in terms of style with Legion and BFA. Is there much of a plan going forward? Or what would we sort of be expecting in terms of cadence?
I think we're pretty happy with the patch structure we've really settled on since Legion, of these alternating .5 patches with more major updates that include things like new zones and a new raid tier. And the .5s are more either systems-driven updates that refresh the existing content, or evergreen expansions to Warcraft as a whole, like a new battleground or expanding time walking, things along those lines. We have a mix of, we're starting to plan out the big major beats of our story, places we're going to visit, what the next raid tier is going to be. We have ideas for what all those things are. Of course, a little bit premature to talk about them right now, but then a lot of the rest of our patches remain reactive to what we see as the game evolves and what problems need to be solved and what our players most need.
Yeah, cool. You mentioned time walking on that, because I just heard from another interview, it's probably mid this expansion will get Legion time walking. With there being loads of different time walking weeks, are there any plans to maybe consolidate them, like say doing 2 weeks at once or anything like that?
That's something that we don't have a specific solution for, but definitely realize that as the number of expansions in that pool grows, at some point, if it's like months before specific time walking that year after comes back, that starts to feel too long. So we know we need to do something there, but I don't have a specific solution offhand.
All right, cool. So, hopping into Endgame then. Loot, right. So, general philosophy. Things have changed a little bit. There's no Titan forging, lower drop rates. So, I'm kind of wondering then, there's a bunch of design space freed up. So, what kind of stuff is planned there? Maybe more unique loot, like some of the things we saw in BFA, micro sets, a return of class sets, and essentially just an open-ended question of what is it like? What's it like with loot in terms of, unique things you're going to be putting on it?
So, yes, I think a bit of all of that. Class sets aren't something we're doing right away. The Covenant armor is the focus of our initial sets and that gear that you'll be obtaining in the initial Shadowlands launch. Though we have said that later on in Shadowlands we explicitly want to return to class-themed sets. We know there's a lot of strong fantasy there, but also there's something cool about just the collection aspect of putting those set pieces together and getting a benefit out of it. I think things like unique effects, certainly some of the items that we've seen out of places like Mechagon, and I think of the Bitband ring sets. There's a lot of experiments there that we're really happy with how they turned out. We're trying to, we want a baseline of items to feel simple and accessible, but then enough layered uniqueness and twists along the way that you're not just, getting into a very rote mindset of, okay, crit haste, crit mastery, and it's just the numbers getting a little bit bigger. Trinkets, mini sets, things like that are all ways of varying that core gameplay, making items a bit more situational, making you want something because you have the other half of the set. Those are all things and tools that we plan to employ across Shadowlands itemization as a whole. We're also happy and excited to have legendary items coming back in with much more control on players' part over actually pursuing and obtaining them. And I think also particularly excited to have the crafting professions gain a renewed, sustained importance in that ecosystem, which is something that I think really has been lacking in WoW for, frankly, like a dozen plus years. It's hard to go back and remember the last time that blacksmiths and tailors made things that were truly important and relevant at Endgame. Like, you literally have to go back to probably Burning Crusade. And here, if you want really powerful legendary plate gloves for your warrior, yes, you have the recipe and the rune crafting and the materials that you've gained from running Torghast, but you're going to need to find a blacksmith who is specialized in a very high-level glove pattern to make those gloves for you. You got to get them directly from the smith or get them off the auction house, and that's going to be the template that turns into your legendary item.
Yeah, cool. I mean, all pretty exciting, I think, where that can all go. One quick little one before we finish on loot, and that is, how are you feeling on the quantity of random effects, like procs on the loot that we've got, and how that affects the overall output, and maybe just the balance between those and on use?
So I think there's some interesting quirks there. Some of it is psychology. I've definitely seen no lack of screenshots of combat logs and, hey, look at infinite stars, look at gushing wounds as this % of my damage, and look how completely broken this is. And part of that is just because those things are expressed as their own damage source in the combat log, whereas they're not necessarily stronger than what you're getting from severe or masterful as a corruption, or what you're getting from your stats, or what a trinket that's giving you a bunch of primary stats is doing for you. It's just that is amortized across all of your other abilities, and it doesn't stick out as, hey, this item is doing this much for you. But a lesson we've definitely learned is that those sort of passive sources of damage, it's jarring and disempowering from a player perspective if I push my class ability and 3 separate things get triggered by it, and it feels like I didn't actually push Fireball. The Fireball is almost irrelevant. It's a driver for all these other effects that are differently themed, and that's what's actually doing my damage. But also, if the flat damage sources actually end up being the ones that are simmed or theory crafted to be optimal, that's probably a mistake on our part. Because by definition, like, those aren't really driven by player skill. They're just happening regardless of whether you're doing your rotation perfectly or suboptimally. And if they're the ones that sim the best, if they're the ones that perform the best when you're playing perfectly, then things like, if they're competing with stat bonuses that by definition aren't as effective if you're playing suboptimally, the stat bonuses just are always going to be the wrong answer. And I think ideally, the flat damage effects end up being something that's kind of a middle of the road option if you want a bit more simplicity, if you want something that's reliable. But the player in Limit, the player who's, a top MDI competitor who's going to play as close to the sims as possible, they should want the things that are going to fully take advantage of that. And we should design and tune accordingly.
Okay, cool. Just moving on to the rest of character customization. Part of what ties it all together is the soulbinds, of course, and part of that is conduits. So I think a big community question right now is covenants. From what we understand, they operate like gems. So if you put a conduit in and then you put another one in, the original one is destroyed. So overall, I'm kind of wondering, like, if that is filling a sort of a similar niche to maybe like a major or minor glyph, but, isn't really tied to a profession in terms of the economy and the need for scarcity. What would the team's essentially like design thinking or goal be in the consumable nature versus going for just them being items in your bag so you swap around, or maybe a library-like system like essences?
Yep. So the conduits are going to be, earned from dungeon raid bosses, PvP, vendors in some cases. Our current plan is for them to drop, not like relics did, where they compete with other loot slots, but as a bonus drop when they drop. So that should be an improvement over how things were back in Legion. But they feel like items. They do feel like gems. We're actually currently talking about putting a little bit of passive stats on them, even just stamina in some cases, to offset the throughput benefits that are coming from this system. And so there's a couple of reasons for destructibility. because they feel like items, they feel like things that have stats on them, and thus like gems. If you could just pop them out, then the right way to play would be this really massive nuisance of inventory management, of having your massive collection of conduits off to the side that you're physically hoarding and swapping in and out. That doesn't sound terribly fun. But a bigger philosophical reason is choice. What is and what choice means in World of Warcraft, and what customizing your character means. We already have a ton of systems and decisions that you make on a very micro level, on an encounter by encounter basis, or when you're beginning a Mythic Plus dungeon. And you can change your spec, you can change all of your equipped gear, you can, within the Covenant system, change your soulbind, which soulbind you're going to bring, which path of the soulbind is going to be active, which talents are active. All of those things you can shift around. Then there are other things that are less mutable, like obviously your class, your race. Covenants themselves fall towards that end of the spectrum. And conduits within the soulbind system offer much more customization and flexibility than relics did, where if you were a Ret Paladin, your Ashbringer just had these 3 relic sockets, and you really didn't have the ability to have 2 different Ashbringer loadouts. Whereas with soulbinds, there are 3 separate soulbinds in different paths within the soulbinds, and part of the thinking is that that's where the permanent customization will lie. If the Nadia's tree, which we showed in the stream yesterday, which you can see in the build that you have access to right now, going down one branch of it, there's a duelist trait that is really emphasizing single target DPS that makes you do more damage to a single target that you're focusing on. It's likely that that's going to be an attractive soulbind and soulbind option for someone who is doing a single target raid boss encounter, and you're likely to want to put conduits in that line that's synergized with single target damage. You might have a different line that seems to have more of an AoE type benefit, and you'll put AoE conduits in that one and respec accordingly before you go do a dungeon. Or if you have utility survival perks in a soulbind tree and you want that one active, you can have conduits that synergize with that. Across all 3 soulbinds, there's quite a few conduit slots. These aren't going to be ultra rare items. They'll be generally available from a wide variety of sources, and we are loath to add like an extra layer of micro changes that you feel like you have to make, and that really, given the way theory crafting guides work, that you're supposed to make before you enter a given situation, where it's not just, hey, I'm going to pick my AoE soulbind to go do this dungeon. It's, I'm going to replace and resocket these 5 conduits and then redo them for this other dungeon because of whatever reason.
Yeah, I suppose the worry is then like an add-on can just sort of do the whole thing in one click, really.
It's sure, the mechanical inconvenience is part of it, but yes, and anytime players are looking to add-ons to automate or streamline something, I think it's a sign that we've created a system that has, there's inconvenience and nuisance and too many individual decisions that all need to be made simultaneously that aren't actually interesting decisions. Like, it's just a template or a loadout that you're copying from somewhere and stamping in. Whereas I think the decisions of how you're going to customize your soulbinds in a way that hopefully makes you a little bit different from other people, because these are the conduits that you happen to get, or stronger versions of them, and this is the build that you have gravitated towards that has these strengths and weaknesses, that there is a core of RPG customization that lies in those differences, as opposed to if it's just a checklist where everyone ends up ultimately being identical and you're either following the right path or you're doing it wrong, and there's either conformity or going your own way and thus doing it wrong. Nothing is really terribly interesting about that, and adding additional layers of those types of decisions don't really add much. They just turn into more chores that you have to complete in order to be optimal.
Yeah, cool. That helps explain sort of at what level the decision making kind of is in the stack. If I was to do a quick little follow-up in Conduits, from my read of what you said, then if we're doing say you're a tank healer DPS, right?
Yeah.
Would that be a situation where, because your soulbinds don't change the loadout based on your spec, is that a situation where if you're a tank or a healer, you're going to probably have a soulbind that you'll gravitate to, and therefore that's the one you'll spec, sort of in that manner with your conduit choices?
That seems likely. I mean, it's going to be different depending on the exact types of content you're doing, if you're a hybrid versus a pure. But if there's one of the soulbinds that offers more utility survival-based options, that probably isn't the one that you're going to gravitate towards for your ret spec, but you might for prot, and put synergistic conduits in it, and then that soulbind and its loadout in terms of which path you've taken through the tree are saved and associated with that spec. When you respec from ret to prot out in the field, you just have the soulbind pre-slotted, ready to go, and you can do what you want, but it's the product of choices that you've made to build that out.
All right, cool. If I was to move on to another aspect of the Covenants, weekly renown. So this is something I've been pretty excited about since you guys talked about AP back in BlizzCon. So I've been wondering, how does the weekly renown cap actually work? Is there maybe a way where it's throttled weekly in terms of player power, but maybe unthrottled in other ways? And in some ways, it reminds me a bit of how I would have engaged with Mists of Pandaria Valor points. So on that side of the question, is there any sort of catch-up system for alts that we can maybe see sort of in the same vein as MoB?
Sure. So yeah, the way we're currently planning for Renown to work is each week in your Covenant, you have a couple of weekly quests that are to go and gather a certain amount of Anima, bring it back to the Covenant, and you'll get that Anima from a wide variety of sources based on your gameplay preferences across the 4 zones of Shadowlands. Then also to retrieve some souls from the Maw, and those only come from the Maw. If you do those 2 things, you're optimal in terms of your Renown advancement. Any extra Anima or souls that you happen to get can go into accelerating more of your utility perks and benefits from some of your other Covenant structures, or healing your champions from your mission table so that they can go back out into the field faster. These are things that aren't directly meant to be power, but they're progression along utility and towards cosmetic goals and things like that. That can be a function of how much you play. I mean, we want the person who does play a lot to feel like they have goals to work towards, as opposed to just running out of things completely, which was, I think, a drawback of the way Valor worked in Mists of Pandaria. As a semi-hardcore competitive player, you'd quickly cap out on your Valor at the start of the week, and then if a friend was asking you to run a dungeon or something, you were probably only doing it out of the goodness of your heart, not with any possible gain for your character in mind. And there's value when you feel like you can get something there. For catch-up, the system we have in mind from the start is if you are at all behind on Renown, like you're kind of below par, whether that's because you're an alt who hit max level later on, you recently switched Covenants, you came to Shadowlands late, there will be other sources of Renown around the world that are just available as part of your regular activities. You may have an extra bonus reward from a world quest that's up, or you might get a sigil that increases your Renown from the chest at the end of a dungeon. And those will just give you direct accelerated catch-up until you get close to, where everyone else is. I think something we've tried to avoid is going down a path where catch-up just means we're removing gates, and catching up means you just have to do the same activity over and over and over again. Like, yes, it's better than being permanently behind, but I'm actually not sure if, saying, okay, you can just do 20 hours worth of questing nonstop to get caught up is really a great player experience. We want to make it so that you can just play the game, doing the types of content that you want to do, whether that's running dungeons or whatever else, and make progress on getting your Renown caught up to where everyone else is.
Okay, yeah, cool. Covenant swapping. Is there any thoughts right now on what the cost of that would actually be?
So I think so the current plan is that leaving your Covenant is simple and costless. If I join the Venthyr at the start when I hit level 60, and I decide, actually, after a week or 2, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, it's kind of lame, I don't like these parties or whatever, I want to join the Kyrian, I can just go to the representative of the Kyrian and join, and that's that. And all the catch-up systems will be in place to let me quickly get ramped up and powered up in my sanctum over there. Now, where the cost comes into play is if I want to go back to the Venthyr for whatever reason. Effectively, narratively, I have broken a sacred oath that I made when I first joined them. They were a bit distrustful of me naturally, and I'm going to have to make it up to them. I'm going to have to prove to them that, yes, sorry, I actually regret my choice. I do want to come back. Please let me back in. And we haven't figured out exactly what the process is going to be there. We don't want it to be, it's kind of a balance between just frankly, a painful grind, which we don't really want to encourage, or just something that might take a couple of weeks, so that effectively you can't be switching back. It might be easy, but time consuming, so that you just can't switch back and forth from boss to boss or from tier to tier. Because again, the second you can do that, it's no longer a part of your identity. If you're committed to making a long-term change, we don't want there to be a significant barrier there. Whether it's because you want to see a different part of the story or because you genuinely regret your choice, you shouldn't feel locked into it. Now, if you do leave a covenant and do come back, all of your progress that you've made will be saved. All of your things you've unlocked, your soulbinds, your sanctum upgrades, those are all present and preserved. But really, the main goal is to make sure this doesn't turn into a system where the player expectation is that I go Venthyr for this raid boss, then I Hearth and respec to Kyrian for this next one, and so forth.
Yeah.
Because again,
cool. I have it on good authority that we are out of time.
Okay.
But thank you. It was a pleasure. I'm sure we'll talk again in the future.
Absolutely. I
And
love it.
yeah, good luck. I'm sure you've got a long day ahead of you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. Cheers. See you later.